The rain came down like a judgment. It wasn't the soft, romantic drizzle you see in movies. This was Georgia rain, the kind that soaks through your bones and turns red clay into something that clings to your boots like regret. The firing range sat in a bowl of pine trees, their branches sagging under the weight of water, and the air tasted like wet metal in gun oil. Staff Sergeant Sarah Kinsley sat on a splintered wooden bench at the edge of the range, perfectly still. She was 34 years old, though the fine lines around her eyes suggested she'd lived twice that. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, practical knot. No makeup, no jewelry except for a plain digital watch on her left wrist. She wore a faded Carhartt jacket, the kind you pick up at a hardware store, jeans that had seen better days, and boots that were functional, not fashionable. To anyone watching, she looked like she'd taken a wrong turn on the way to the feed store. The candidates didn't even see her at first. 12 men, all between 24 and 29, all convinced they were the sharpest shooters in the United States Army. They moved with that particular swagger that comes from 6 months of intensive training, expensive gear, and the absolute certainty that they belong at the top of the food chain. They were loud, laughing, slapping each other on the back. Their voices carried across the wet morning air like they owned the place. Corporal Jax Reed was the loudest of them all. He was 26, built like a college linebacker who'd traded beer for protein shakes. His gear was immaculate, brand new tactical pants with reinforced knees, a high-end rifle sling that probably cost more than Sarah's entire jacket. He had one of those faces that had never been told no, not really, the kind of face that expected the world to step aside. He was the first one to notice her. "Hey, ma'am," he called out, his voice friendly but laced with condescension. "You waiting for your husband to finish qualifying?" The others turned. A few of them chuckled. It wasn't malicious, not exactly. It was reflexive, dismissive, the kind of laugh that says, "You don't belong here," and we all know it. Sarah didn't look up. She was watching the tree line. Her eyes tracked a bird cutting across the range, a small, dark shape against the gray sky. She calculated the lead without thinking about it. Wind speed, distance, the way the rain bent the air. It was as automatic as breathing. One of the other candidates, Sergeant Dalton Merrick, older than the rest at 29, walked closer. He had a kinder face, the kind that suggested he'd seen enough of the world to know when to shut up. But even he couldn't resist. "You okay there, ma'am?" he asked. "This isn't really a spectator sport. Range is going to go hot in about 10 minutes. You might want to head back to the parking lot." Sarah's thumb traced the edge of her jacket pocket. It was a habit, a grounding mechanism. Her hands were calloused, the kind of calluses that don't come from a weekend at the gun range. They come from years, decades, from holding on to things that want to fly away at 1,700 feet per second. She checked her pulse. Her left hand moved almost imperceptibly, 2 fingers pressing against the radial artery in her wrist. Thump, 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 52 beats per minute. Even with Corporal Reed's voice ringing in her ears, even with the rain starting to soak through her collar, her heart stayed in the basement. The candidates were jacked up. You could see it in their twitchy movements, the way they checked their gear 5 times a minute, adjusting slings, tapping magazines, running through mental checklists. They were fighting the environment, fighting the rifle, fighting themselves. Sarah just waited. She knew something they didn't. Long-range shooting isn't about strength. It isn't about who can scream the loudest or run the fastest with a rucksack. It's about disappearing. It's about becoming a part of the wind, a part of the dirt, until you're not a person anymore. You're a function, a held breath, a ghost. Her mind drifted. She was 9 years old again, standing in the frost-covered grass of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Her father stood beside her, a man of few words and even fewer smiles. Garrett Kinsley, hunter, tradesman, a man who believed that the world didn't owe you a damn thing, but it would teach you everything if you paid attention. He'd handed her the old bolt-action rifle. It felt like a cannon in her small hands. "Sarah," he'd whispered, his voice like dry leaves scraping across stone. "The air in your lungs, it's a liar. It moves you. It pushes the barrel. Breath is the enemy of the shot, girl. You find the empty space between the beats, and you stay there." She'd killed her first deer that morning, a clean shot, straight through the heart. She remembered the way her father had looked at her afterward. Not proud exactly, just knowing, like he'd seen something in her that she hadn't seen in herself yet. That lesson became her gospel. Through basic training, through sniper school, through 3 tours in places the map forgets, she had lived in that empty space. The space between heartbeats. The space where fear can't reach you. The rain picked up. The candidates started pulling their gear out of hard cases, their movements quick and efficient. They were good. She could see that. They'd been trained well. But good wasn't the same as quiet. Good wasn't the same as still. Corporal Reed was adjusting his scope, his fingers moving over the turrets with the kind of confidence that comes from muscle memory. He had a Night Force optic, top of the line, the kind of glass that costs more than a used car. He was talking to his buddy, another candidate with a thick neck and a shaved head. "I'm telling you, man, this wind is going to eat people alive today," Reed said. "You see the way it's gusting? Fish-tail pattern, probably shifting every 30 seconds. You got to be on the Kestrel, running the numbers in real time, or you're just throwing lead." His buddy nodded. "You ready for the cold bore?" Reed grinned. "Born ready." Sarah felt a slight ache in her right shoulder. It was always there, a low throb that intensified in the cold and damp. A souvenir from Kunar province. A piece of shrapnel about the size of a pencil eraser, buried too deep to remove without risking nerve damage. The doctors had told her it would hurt for the rest of her life. She didn't mind. It was a grounding wire, a reminder that she was still here, still breathing, still capable of making the world stop with a single squeeze of a trigger. At exactly 07:45, Master Sergeant Elias Thorne stepped onto the concrete pad at the head of the range. Thorne was a man who looked like a topographical map of a bad neighborhood. His face was all hard angles and sun damage, the kind of skin that had been baked and frozen and baked again in every desert and mountain range the Army could send him to. He was 52 years old, a peer of Sarah's, though he had a decade on her. They'd crawled to the same Afghan dust 10 years ago, back when the war still felt like it had a point. Today, he didn't even look at her, didn't offer a nod or a hello. He knew the game. He wanted to see how these candidates handled a distraction in their midst. "First event is the cold bore," Thorne barked, his voice cutting through the rain like a blade. "One shot, one target at 500 meters. No warm-ups, no excuses. If you can't hit center mass with your first breath, you're just a loud-mouthed rifleman with an expensive telescope." The candidates scrambled. Corporal Jax Reed was first on the mat. He dropped into the prone position with practiced efficiency, his body forming a solid platform. His left hand gripped the forend of his rifle. His right hand curled around the pistol grip, finger indexed along the receiver. But Sarah saw something he didn't. He was gripping too tight, white-knuckling the stock. His shoulders were tense, bunched up around his neck like he was trying to choke the rifle into submission. He was fighting the Georgia humidity, fighting the wind, fighting his own heartbeat. The wind was a nightmare. It wasn't a steady blow. It was a fishtail wind, the kind that makes snipers question their career choices. It would gust from the left at 10 miles an hour, then drop to a dead calm, then swirl back from the right. Unpredictable, malicious. Reed's Kestrel weather meter was clipped to his belt. He didn't even look at it. He was running the numbers in his head, calculating holdovers and windage based on what he thought he knew. Crack, the rifle barked. The round went wide right. A clean miss, not even close. A small geyser of mud erupted about 2 feet to the right of the steel silhouette. Reed swore, a sharp, angry sound. He started frantically adjusting his turrets, twisting the knobs like he could dial his way out of failure. One by one, the others followed. Crack, crack, crack. Out of 12 candidates, only 2 even nicked the edge of the steel. The rest were hitting the dirt, sending up small fountains of Georgia clay. Sarah sat on her bench, watching the grass. It was leaning slightly to the left at the 300-meter mark, bending under a steady crosswind. But at the target, 500 meters out, the rain was falling straight down. No bend, no lean. There was a pocket of dead air in the middle of the range, a thermal layer where the wind just stopped. She'd seen it the moment she sat down. Corporal Reed stood up, his face flushed with frustration. His jaw was tight, his hands were shaking just a little. He looked around, searching for something to blame. The wind, the rain, the rifle. And then he saw her, Sarah, sitting on the bench, watching him. His ego needed a target. He walked over, his boots heavy on the wet concrete. He wiped mud from his knee and leaned down, placing one hand on the bench next to her. Close, invading her space. "Rough day for a spectator, huh?" he said. His voice was tight, controlled, but there was an edge to it. The edge of a man who wasn't used to missing. Sarah looked up at him. She didn't blink, didn't smile, just watched a bead of rain roll down his forehead. Reed kept talking. "You probably don't get how this works," he said. "See, we're dealing with MOA, minute of angle. It's a math problem. At 500 yards, a 1-degree shift in the wind moves the bullet 5 inches. You got to calculate the drift, adjust your hold, and squeeze at exactly the right moment. It's probably a bit much to grasp if you've never been behind the glass." He was mansplaining the very basics of her life's work. He spoke to her like she was a child, like she was a tourist who had wandered into a laboratory and needed someone to explain what the microscopes were for. Sarah didn't correct him. She didn't pull out credentials or put him in his place. She just let the silence sit between them, let it grow heavy and uncomfortable. Let the rain fill the space where words should be. Then very quietly she said, "You should check your level." Reed blinked. "My what?" "Your bubble level," Sarah replied. Her voice was a flat line, no emotion, no inflection, just information. "You're canting the rifle to the left when you squeeze. It's only a few degrees, but at 500 meters, that's why you're hitting the dirt." Reed laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. He turned to his buddies, raising his voice. "Hey guys, the lady says I'm canting my rifle. Maybe I should ask her to hold my purse while I go again." The group erupted. Snickers, chuckles. A few of them exchanged glances, shaking their heads. It was the boys' club closing its doors. It was a dynamic Sarah knew by heart. The collective exclusion. The silent agreement that she didn't belong in their circle of warriors. She felt the sting, that old familiar heat in the back of her neck. The anger that wanted to rise up and take the shape of words. But she didn't let it reach her hands. She checked her pulse. 52. "All right, enough grab ass," Thorne yelled. "Move to the wood line. Phase 2, the stalk." The challenge was simple on paper. Move 300 meters through the brush unnoticed and kill the instructor sitting in the tower with high-end thermal optics. In practice, it was hell. The candidates began their ghillie prep. They were piling on the burlap, the jute, the plastic leaves. They looked like walking haystacks. They were obsessed with the visual, with looking like the snipers they'd seen in movies. All ghillie suit and no ghost. Sarah walked along the edge of the prep area. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning the candidates as they worked. She saw them spraying themselves with scent blocker, adjusting their camouflage, checking and rechecking their loadouts. But she noticed something they were all ignoring. The sun was trying to peek through the clouds. The humidity was rising. The temperature was climbing. Their wet burlap suits were about to become thermal beacons. She stopped near Corporal Reed. He was busy tying a branch to his shoulder, weaving it into the netting of his ghillie suit. "You're going to bloom," she said. Reed didn't look up. "Excuse me?" "The burlap," Sarah continued. It's soaked. Your body heat is going to trap under that wet fabric, and you're going to look like a campfire on the thermal scope. You need to vent your suit. Let the air move, or you'll be glowing before you hit the first 100 meters. Reed still didn't look at her. He spat on the ground. A deliberate dismissal. Thanks for the fashion advice, ma'am, he said. We'll stick to the manual. We've been training for this for 6 months. I think we know how to hide. Sarah watched them crawl into the woods. It was painful to watch. They were moving too fast, dragging their heavy suits through the mud, creating trails, breaking branches. Their movement was frantic, driven by ego and adrenaline, instead of patience and precision. Inside the observation tower, Master Sergeant Elias Thorne sat with his thermal binoculars pressed to his face. He didn't have to search. Within 10 minutes, he saw a bright, white-hot shape moving through the blue-green background of the forest. Then another, and another, 3 more. Contact, Thorne radioed, his voice crackling over the range speakers. Candidate 7, you're dead. Candidate 3, I see your head. Candidate 12, you look like a goddamn neon sign. Out. All of you. Out. Corporal Reed's frustration finally boiled over. He walked right up to her. His chest was heaving. His face was red. He stopped inches from the bench, towering over her. What are you even doing here? He snapped. You come out here, you whisper your tips, you act like you know the struggle, but you haven't moved an inch. You haven't felt the weight. You're just a ghost, a tourist watching us bleed. The group crowded around. A wall of camouflage and resentment. 12 men, all taller than her, all stronger than her, all convinced they'd earned the right to be angry. Sarah felt the space around her shrink. I've moved my share of inches, Corporal, she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't waver. It stayed in that low, clinical register, the sound of a surgeon describing a terminal diagnosis. Oh yeah? Reed sneered. Where? In a video game? In a book? He reached out, a sudden, aggressive movement. He tapped the top of her rifle case with 2 fingers, hard, deliberate. Why don't you show us what's in the box then? He said. Or is it just a lunch tray? Sarah's hand moved. It was a blur. A flash of motion that ended with her fingers wrapped firmly around Reed's wrist. She didn't twist. She didn't strike. She just held him there. Her grip was like iron, not the grip of a civilian, the grip of someone who'd spent their life holding on to things that wanted to fly away. Reed froze. He looked down at her hand, then up at her eyes. For the first time, he saw the shadow clearly. He saw the cold, predatory stillness that he'd been mocking all morning, the absolute lack of fear, the complete control. The box stays closed until it's time for work, Sarah said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried. And Corporal, your heart rate is 95. You're shaking. You'll never hit the steel with those hands. She released his wrist. Reed stepped back. He didn't say anything. He just stared at her, his mouth slightly open, his breathing shallow. Sarah turned her back on them, returned to her bench. She sat down slowly, her movements deliberate, and adjusted the strap of her watch. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of respect. Not yet. It was the silence of confusion. They didn't know what she was, but for the first time, they were starting to realize that whatever she wasn't a tourist. Master Sergeant Elias Thorne watched from the tower. A small, grim smile touched his lips. He knew the guest instructor was about to stop being a guest. The rain began to pick up again. A steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof of the range. The real test was coming, and Staff Sergeant Sarah Kinsley was just getting started. The rain didn't just pick up, it turned into a horizontal curtain of gray, the kind of downpour that erases the horizon and makes you question whether the sky has always been this angry. The wind howled through the pine trees, bending their tops like they were bowing to something greater than themselves. Master Sergeant Elias Thorne stepped to the edge of the concrete pad, his boots splashing in the growing puddles. Water streamed off the brim of his cover. He raised one gloved hand and pointed toward a distant, jagged gap in the tree line, a place the instructors called the throat. "All right, gentlemen," Thorne bellowed, his voice straining against the wind. "New target, 1,100 meters. It's tucked inside that draw, right there in the canyon. The wind in that gap is moving twice as fast as the wind on this line. It's a literal meat grinder for bullets. If you can't read the environment, you're just making noise." The candidates scrambled to their positions. The mud sucked at their boots. Their hands were cold, fingers stiff. They were soaked through, their OCPs clinging to their bodies like wet canvas. Corporal Jax Reed was the first to try. He dropped to the prone position, his rifle settling into the mud with a wet squelch. He had his Kestrel out, a high-tech weather meter, waving it in the air like some kind of divining rod. His thumb worked the buttons, pulling up wind speed, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure. He was punching numbers into his ballistic computer, a sleek device mounted to his rifle scope. His spotter, a thick-necked candidate named Corporal Hayes, crouched beside him with a spotting scope. "Wind at the line is 8 miles per hour, left to right," Hayes said. "But it's gusting. I'm seeing swirls. Call it 10. Reed clicked his turrets. The mechanical sound was sharp, precise. Left, left, up. He was adjusting for windage and elevation, dialing in what the computer told him the bullet needed. He settled behind the rifle, controlled his breathing, squeezed. Crack. The round disappeared into the gray. No splash, no impact. Just gone, swallowed by the rain and distance. "Left," Hayes yelled. 2 mils left." Reed adjusted. His jaw was tight. His hands were shaking now, just a little. The cold, the pressure, the eyes of his peers on his back. Crack. "High," Hayes shouted. "The lift got it. You're over the top." Reed slammed his fist into the mud. "God damn it." One by one, the candidates took their turns. They burned through magazines. They adjusted and readjusted. The air was thick with the smell of burnt powder and the sound of frustration. Crack, 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 the rhythm of failure. Out of 12 of the Army's finest sniper candidates, not a single piece of steel rang out. The ego on the range didn't just deflate, it died. They were looking at their rifles like they were broken toys, checking and rechecking their optics, questioning their computers, questioning themselves. "It's impossible," Reed muttered. He threw his empty magazine into the mud, where it landed with a wet slap. "The wind is shifting every 3 seconds. You can't time a shot like that. Nobody can." Master Sergeant Thorne didn't look at Reed. He turned his head slowly, deliberately, looking toward the back of the range, toward the quiet woman in the faded Carhartt jacket. "Kinsley," Thorne said. The name was a low rumble, a challenge and an invitation wrapped into one word. "You want to show these kids why they're still wearing training wheels?" The range went silent. Even the rain seemed to quiet down for a second, like the world itself was holding its breath. The candidates looked from Thorne to Sarah, their eyes wide with a mix of confusion and growing realization. A few of them exchanged glances. Reed's face went pale, then red, then pale again. Sarah didn't say a word. She didn't boast, didn't smile, didn't even acknowledge the question directly. She just stood up from her bench, slow and deliberate, and walked toward the center of the line. Her boots made soft sounds on the wet concrete. She moved with a kind of economy of motion that suggested nothing was wasted. No excess energy, no unnecessary movement, just purpose. She stepped over the dead brass on the ground, dozens of spent casings glinting dully in the gray light. The evidence of all that failure. She didn't use a kestrel, didn't pull out a computer, didn't check a range card or consult a ballistic chart. She just dropped into the prone position. It wasn't the clunky, heavy movement of the candidates. It was liquid. One moment she was standing, the next she was part of the earth. Her body settled into the mud like it had been designed to be there, like the ground had been waiting for her. Her rifle, that old scarred M24, found her shoulder like it was coming home. The M24 wasn't pretty. The stock was worn, the finish rubbed off in places where her hands had gripped it 10,000 times. There were scratches and dings, the kind that come from being dragged through rocks, in sand, in snow. It was a museum piece compared to the high-tech rifles the candidates were using, but it was hers. She didn't look through the scope immediately. She stared at the tree line with both eyes open, her head slightly tilted. She was watching the rhythm of the rain, the way it fell, the way it moved, the way it bent around the wind. She was waiting for the lull. The half-second heartbeat where the wind in the canyon and the wind on the line canceled each other out, where the chaos aligned into something predictable. Corporal Reed was standing behind her now, his arms crossed. His voice came out in a harsh whisper. "Ma'am," he said, The hold is at least 4 mils left. You can't." "Quiet," Thorne snapped. The word cut through the air like a whip crack. Reed shut his mouth, but his eyes stayed on Sarah. Everyone's eyes stayed on Sarah. Sarah's finger rested on the trigger. Not pulling, not pressing, just resting. A feather's weight. Her breathing wasn't breathing at all. It was a slow, controlled tide. In, hold, out, hold. The rhythm of someone who'd learned to make oxygen irrelevant. She wasn't fighting the rifle. She was melting into it, becoming one system, one function. She felt the pulse in her wrist. Thump, thump, thump. 51 beats per minute, slower than it had been all morning. Slower than most people could get without meditation or drugs. She waited for the space between. The space her father had taught her about in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The space where fear can't reach you, where doubt doesn't exist, where there's nothing but you and the target and the mathematics of wind and gravity. She didn't use the turrets. She used a holdover, an instinctive visual adjustment based on 20 years of seeing the invisible. She could feel the wind on her left cheek, 8 miles per hour. But in the canyon, it was faster, 12, maybe 13. And there was a thermal layer at 600 meters where the air was rising, creating lift. She accounted for all of it without thinking about it, the way a musician plays without reading the notes. Crack! The M24 barked, a deep, authoritative sound that made the lighter, high-tech rifles seem like cap guns. The recoil pushed back into her shoulder, familiar and solid. Sarah didn't move, didn't lift her head to look. She stayed on the glass, her eye pressed to the scope, following the trace of the bullet through the air. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The world held its breath. 4 seconds. Clang! The sound of steel hitting came back through the rain. A sharp, bell-like tone that cut through the Georgia mist like a church bell on a Sunday morning. It wasn't just a hit. It was a T-box strike, right between the eyes of the silhouette, at over 1,000 meters, with a cold bore, with a rifle that belonged in a museum, in a wind that had defeated 12 of the Army's finest. Sarah remained perfectly still for a long moment. She didn't cheer, didn't pump her fist, didn't even smile. She just cycled the bolt, slow and smooth, catching the spent, smoking brass in her hand before it could hit the mud. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the silence of 100 assumptions being shattered at once. The silence of men realizing they'd been looking at the world through the wrong end of the telescope. Corporal Reed looked like he'd seen a ghost. His mouth was open. His face had gone from red to pale to a kind of grayish white. His hands hung at his sides, limp. The other candidates were frozen. Their eyes darted between the tiny woman on the mat and the distant, impossible target. Some of them were shaking their heads, like they could deny what they just witnessed, like they could will it not to be true. But it was true. They had just seen something they didn't think existed. They had seen a master at work, and they realized with a crushing sense of humility that they hadn't just been disrespectful to a civilian, they had been mocking a legend. Sarah stood up slowly. She brushed the wet sand from her jacket with one hand, the movement casual, unhurried. She looked at Corporal Reed, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a strange kind of pity. The look you give someone who's just realized how much they don't know. "The wind doesn't care about your computer, Corporal," she said. Her voice was as cold and clear as a mountain stream. "It only cares if you're brave enough to listen to it." She stepped back toward her bench, leaving the elite soldiers standing in the rain, wondering who the hell had been sitting in their midst all morning. Master Sergeant Thorne just nodded. A single, sharp movement. The lesson had finally begun. The rain seemed to lose its sting as a black SUV pulled up to the edge of the range. The tires cut through the puddles, sending up sheets of water. The engine shut off. The driver's door opened. Out stepped a man who looked like he'd been carved from a block of granite. Command Sergeant Major Silas Vance. He was a legend in the sniper community, 58 years old. A man who'd spent more time in combat zones than most of these candidates had been alive. He'd been to every war the United States had fought since the first Gulf War. Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, places that didn't even make the news. He had the kind of face that suggested he'd seen things that would break most men, and he'd kept walking anyway. He moved with a slight limp, an old knee injury from a helicopter crash in Mosul, but he moved with purpose, authority. He walked toward the firing line, his eyes scanning the group. The candidates instinctively straightened. Even covered in mud, even exhausted, they recognized the kind of man who could end careers with a single word. But Vance didn't look at them. His eyes locked onto Sarah, who was quietly wiping a smudge of oil from her M24 with a piece of cloth. The range went absolutely still. Vance stopped walking. He stood there, 10 feet away from her, rain streaming down his face. And then he did something that made the hair on the back of Corporal Jax Reed's neck stand up. He reached up and slowly removed his cover. He stood there in the pouring rain, bareheaded, showing a level of deference that a command sergeant major usually reserves for the fallen, for the flag, for things sacred. "Staff Sergeant Kinsley," Vance said. His voice was thick with a respect that felt heavy, like it carried the weight of years. "I haven't seen you since the valley, since shock." Sarah looked up. Her hands paused on the rifle. Her eyes softened, just a fraction. The hard edge that had been there all morning eased back, just a little. "Sergeant Major," she said, "good to see you still kicking." Vance turned to the stunned candidates. He looked at each one of them, his gaze moving slowly across the line. When he got to Reed, he held there for a long moment. Reed looked like he wanted to vanish into the mud. "I see you boys have been testing our guest," Vance said. His voice dropped into a dangerous, low rumble. And she didn't do it on a range. Another pause. The rain drummed on the metal roof of the tower. Tink, tink, tink. She did it at night, in a blizzard, while a ranger platoon was being squeezed in a kill zone. Vance's voice grew quieter but somehow more intense. She sat on a ridge for 14 hours without moving, without eating, without pissing. She held an entire mountain pass by herself. One woman, one rifle, against an enemy that outnumbered her 50-1. He turned back to Sarah, and for just a moment, his expression softened. She's the reason those men came home. She's the reason I'm still standing here. The shift in the air was physical. The candidates didn't just stand straighter, they looked like they were trying to snap their own spines into a position of attention. Reed's face went from pale to a deep, burning crimson, a flush of shame that started at his neck and spread up to his hairline. He didn't look away. He couldn't. He was frozen, his eyes locked on Sarah, seeing her for the first time. The only sound was the rain hitting the metal roof, the steady, relentless percussion of water on steel, the mockery, the jokes, the boys' club. It had all evaporated. In its place was a silence so profound, it felt like a prayer. They weren't looking at a civilian anymore. They weren't looking at a woman who didn't belong. They were looking at the pinnacle of their profession. They were looking at someone who had broken history, not with a shout, but with a single, perfectly timed breath. Sarah didn't acknowledge the words. She just returned to cleaning her rifle, her movements slow and methodical. Like none of this mattered, like praise was as irrelevant as insults. Vance put his cover back on. He turned to Thorne. "Carry on, Master Sergeant." Thorne nodded. "Yes, Sergeant Major." Vance walked back to his SUV. Before he got in, he looked back at Sarah one more time. He didn't salute, didn't wave, just looked. A moment of understanding between two people who'd walked through the same fire and somehow made it out the other side. Then he was gone. The silence on the range was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens after a thunderclap, where the air feels thin and the world just stops spinning for a second. Corporal Jax Reed, the one who had been so loud, so sure of himself just an hour ago, didn't join the others in their rigid posture. He didn't stand there and stare. Instead, he did something better. He stepped forward. His boots squelched in the Georgia mud. He walked up to Sarah, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't offer a scripted apology, didn't try to explain away his arrogance, or make excuses for his behavior. He simply reached into his kit and pulled out his high-end spotter scope. The Swarovski optic he'd saved 6 months of pay to buy. The piece of gear he treated like a firstborn child. With both hands, and with his head bowed just a fraction, he held it out to her. It was an ancient gesture, a submission, a warrior offering his weapon to someone he recognized as superior. He wasn't just giving her a tool, he was handing over his ego. He was asking, begging, for her to lead. Sarah looked at the scope. Then she looked at the boy. She saw the shame in his eyes, but she also saw the hunger, the sudden, desperate need to be better than he was 10 minutes ago. She didn't humiliate him, didn't bring up the fashion advice or the jokes about her purse, didn't throw his words back in his face. She took the scope, examined it, turned it over in her hands. "The glass is tilted, Corporal," she said softly. Her voice was barely a whisper against the wind. "If you don't level your tripod, the world will always look crooked." Reed nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. Sarah set the scope down on the bench beside her rifle case. Then she looked at the rest of the candidates. They were all watching her now, all waiting. "Get your gear," she said. "We're going back out." For the next 4 hours, the guests disappeared. Sarah Kinsley didn't stay on that dry bench. She didn't stand apart and observe from a safe distance. She dropped back into the mud. She crawled through the slush and the pine needles with them. She laid down in the dirt next to each man, her voice a calm, rhythmic pulse in their ears. She taught them the art of the hold, not the math they'd found in the U.S. Army Sniper School manual, not the formulas in tables and computer-generated solutions. She taught them the soul of the shot. "Don't pull the trigger," she told Reed, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as he lined up the 1,000-meter target again. "You let the rifle decide when it's ready. You just stay in the empty space. You know what that is?" Reed shook his head. "It's the space between your heartbeats," Sarah said. "It's the space where you're not thinking about the shot. You're not hoping. You're not trying. You're just there. And the rifle knows when you're there. It'll tell you when to squeeze. Reed tried again. This time, he didn't white-knuckle the grip. He let his hand rest easy. He felt his pulse. Thump. 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 He waited. Crack. Clang. The steel rang out. Reed's first hit at 1,000 meters. His hands started shaking, but not from nerves, from something else. Something that felt like relief and awe mixed together. She moved to Sergeant Dalton Merrick, who was struggling with mirage reading, the heat shimmer that rises off the ground and distorts your view of the target. "You're reading the computer," Sarah said, crouching beside him. "Read the Earth. You see that shimmer at 700? That's the air showing you where it's moving. It's a river. You wouldn't ignore a river if you were trying to cross it, would you? Same principle. The air is a river. Learn to see the current." Merrick squinted through his scope, and then he saw it. The shimmer, the way it moved, the direction, the speed. "Holy shit," he whispered. "Yeah," Sarah said. A small smile touched her lips. Holy shit. She taught them how to read the wind on their skin instead of on a screen. "Close your eyes," she said to a young specialist named Garrett. "Feel the pressure on your left cheek? That's 8 miles per hour. Now wait, feel it drop? That's your window. That's when you take the shot." She taught them that a sniper isn't a person with a gun. A sniper is a ghost that the environment forgot to erase. "You don't fight the world," she said, her voice carrying across the range. "You become part of it. You blend. You disappear. And when the moment is right, you reappear just long enough to change everything." She told them about her father, about the Blue Ridge Mountains, about the first time she'd killed something. "My father taught me that breath is the enemy," she said, and he was right. But he was also wrong about one thing. They all looked at her. "Breath isn't the enemy," Sarah continued. "Fear is. Breath is just how fear shows itself. The shaking, the gasping, the panic. That's all fear. Master the breath, you master the fear. Master the fear, you master the shot." By the time the sun began to dip behind the pines, the candidates were exhausted. Their OCPs were ruined, caked in layers of red Georgia clay. Their faces were streaked with mud and sweat. Their hands were raw from gripping wet metal and crawling through brush. But their eyes were different. They weren't jacked up on bravado anymore. They weren't loud or cocky or convinced they knew everything. They were quiet, focused, humble. They stood in a semicircle around her, these young warriors, and they looked at her with something that went beyond respect. It was reverence. The kind of reverence you feel when you're in the presence of something rare, something you didn't know existed until you saw it with your own eyes. Corporal Jax Reed was the last one to get up from the firing line. He'd finally hit the steel 3 times in a row at 1,000 meters. 3 clean hits, center mass, using Sarah's technique, the breath, the empty space, the patience. He walked over to her. His face was splattered with mud. His hands were shaking from exhaustion. He didn't say a word. He just stood there for a moment looking at her, and then he snapped a sharp, crisp salute. It wasn't required. She was a civilian. It wasn't in the regulations. But it was the most honest thing he'd done all day. Sarah didn't salute back. She wasn't active duty anymore. The rules didn't allow it. But she gave him a small, tired nod. The kind one veteran gives another when they both know the cost of the ground they're standing on. Reed held the salute for a long moment. Then he dropped his hand and walked away. He didn't look back. Sarah watched him go. Watched all of them start to pack their gear, their movements slow and heavy with exhaustion. She had passed the torch. She hadn't just taught them how to hit a target, she'd taught them how to be silent. And in the world of the long-range kill, silence is the only thing that keeps you alive. The rain finally slowed to a thin, rhythmic drizzle, the kind that makes the pine trees look like ghosts in the Georgia mist. The light was fading now, turning everything soft in gray. The range had that emptiness that comes after something significant has happened, when the air itself feels different. Staff Sergeant Sarah Kinsley didn't stick around for the debrief. She didn't wait for Master Sergeant Thorne to pull her aside for a formal thank you or a commemorative coin. She didn't linger for handshakes or photographs or any of the ceremonial gestures that usually follow a day like this. That wasn't why she came. She walked back to her bench, her movement slow and weary. Her shoulder ached. The old shrapnel wound was throbbing now, a deep, bone-level pain that would keep her up tonight. But she'd learned to live with pain. Pain was just information. It told you that you were still here, still capable. She began to pack away the M24. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. She wiped down the bolt one last time, her fingers lingering on the scarred stock. This rifle had been with her through 3 tours. Through Kunar Province, through the Korengal Valley, through that long, impossible night in Shock Valley, when the world had turned into white noise and muzzle flashes and the desperate screams of dying men. She ran her thumb along a deep gouge in the stock, a scar from a piece of shrapnel that had missed her face by 3 inches. She remembered the moment it happened, the way the world had gone silent for a second, the way her ears had rung for 3 days afterward. She didn't need a parade. She didn't need her name on a plaque in the National Infantry Museum. She didn't need any of that. What she wanted was something quieter, something that would last longer than bronze and granite. She wanted to be remembered by the change in the way those boys held their rifles, by the way they now looked at the wind with a sense of reverence instead of frustration, by the fact that somewhere down the line, in a valley far from home, one of those boys would remember to breathe, and he would live. That was the only legacy that mattered. She snapped the latches on her rifle case. Clack, clack, clack. The sound was final, definitive. The range felt different now, quieter. The bravado had been replaced by a heavy, professional stillness. The kind of silence that comes when men realize they've been in the presence of something they'll never fully understand. Master Sergeant Elias Thorne watched her from the edge of the concrete pad. He stood with his arms crossed, his weathered face unreadable. He'd known Sarah for 10 years. He'd been her spotter on that ridge in Shock Valley. He'd watched her make the impossible shot that saved 37 Rangers from being overrun. He'd seen her stay calm when the world was on fire. He wanted to say something, to thank her, to acknowledge what she'd done today, but he didn't call out. He knew you don't thank a shadow for passing through. You just appreciate the coolness it leaves behind. Sarah picked up her rifle case and started walking toward her truck. An old Ford F-150, 20 years old, with rust spots on the fenders and a crack in the windshield. It was parked at the far end of the lot, away from the neat rows of tactical vehicles and government SUVs. She moved slowly, favoring her right leg just a little. Another old injury. A torn meniscus from a bad landing during a helicopter insertion. The kind of thing that never quite heals right. Behind her, the candidates were still packing their gear. They moved quietly now, respectfully, like they were in a church. Corporal Jax Reed stood by his rifle case, his hands resting on the lid. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, staring at nothing. His mind was still processing what had happened, the humiliation, the revelation, the strange, profound sense of gratitude that comes when someone shows you how little you know and how much further you can go. Sergeant Dalton Merrick walked up beside him. "You good, man?" Reed didn't answer for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "I called her a tourist." Merrick didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. "I told her to hold my purse," Reed continued. His voice was flat, empty. "I mansplained MOA to a woman who made a T-box hit at 1,100 meters in a crosswind that defeated all of us." "Yeah," Merrick said. "You did." Reed finally looked at him. "How do I fix that?" Merrick shrugged. "You don't. You just do better. You take what she taught you and you become the kind of sniper who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. That's how you fix it." Reed nodded slowly. He looked toward Sarah's truck, just as she was climbing into the driver's seat. For a moment, he thought about running over there, about apologizing properly, about trying to explain, but he didn't. Some debts can't be paid with words. Sarah started the engine. The old Ford coughed to life, belching a small cloud of blue smoke. She didn't look back at the range, didn't wave. She just put the truck in gear and drove away, her taillights disappearing into the gray afternoon mist. Just another civilian in an old truck, disappearing into the world like she'd never been there at all. But the shadow of Shock Valley stayed behind. She stayed in the minds of 12 young men who would never look at a woman the same way again, who would never assume competence based on appearance, who would carry her lessons into the dark places where Americans go to fight wars that most people will never hear about. The days after Sarah left the range were strange for the candidates. They trained harder, spoke less. There was a new gravity to everything they did. Corporal Jax Reed became obsessed with breathing exercises. He would sit in his barracks room with his eyes closed, feeling his pulse, counting the beats, searching for that empty space Sarah had talked about. His roommates thought he was losing it, but he didn't care. He'd felt something on that range, something he'd never felt before. A kind of stillness that went deeper than calm. It was like touching the bottom of a pool you thought was endless. He wanted to feel it again. 3 weeks after Sarah's visit, the candidates graduated from the advanced sniper course. 11 of them passed. One washed out. It wasn't Reed. He finished second in the class. The instructors said he'd shown remarkable improvement in the final weeks, that his shooting had gone from technically proficient to something approaching artistry. Reed knew where that came from. He knew who to thank. 2 months after graduation, Reed received his deployment orders. Afghanistan, Helmand Province, a place where the Taliban still moved freely through the mountains, where IEDs turned roads into graveyards, and where American snipers were the only thing keeping some outposts from being overrun. He shipped out in early October. The heat was already starting to fade from the Afghan desert, replaced by the cold winds that came down from the Hindu Kush. He was assigned to a forward operating base called FOB Sturgis, a collection of HESCO barriers in plywood buildings perched on a ridgeline overlooking the Helmand River Valley. His platoon sergeant was a grizzled staff sergeant named Kowalski, a man who'd been in country for 3 rotations and had the hollow eyes to prove it. "You're the new long gun?" Kowalski asked, looking Reed up and down. "Yes, Sergeant." Kowalski nodded. "Good, we need you. Taliban's got a sniper working the North Valley. He's killed 2 of ours in the last month. Both headshots. Both at ranges we didn't think were possible for them. Command thinks he's got a Dragunov, maybe even a Western rifle they captured somewhere. You're here to find him and put him down." Reed felt his pulse quicken. "Roger that, Sergeant." "You scared?" Kowalski asked. It wasn't a challenge, just a question. Reed thought about it. "Yes, Sergeant." Kowalski smiled. A thin, tired smile. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp. It's the ones who aren't scared that get killed." Reed thought about Sarah, about what she'd said. Fear is the enemy. Breath is just how fear shows itself. "I'll get it done, Sergeant," Reed said, and he meant it. The first week at FOB Sturgis was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you check your weapon every 10 minutes and sleep with one eye open. The Taliban sniper didn't show himself, but his presence was everywhere. The soldiers moved differently, faster. They didn't linger in open spaces. They didn't smoke cigarettes outside the bunkers. Fear had changed the way they lived. Reed spent his days studying the valley through his spotting scope. The Swarovski optic that Sarah had looked at and told him was tilted. He'd fixed that, leveled the tripod, made sure everything was true. Now he could see the world the way it actually was. He studied the patterns, the way the villagers moved, the way the goats grazed, the way the Taliban fighters appeared and disappeared like ghosts, using the terrain in ways that suggested they'd been born in these mountains. He was looking for the sniper, the ghost among ghosts. On the 8th day, Reed's spotter, a young specialist named Garrett Voss, spotted movement on a ridgeline 900 meters to the north. "I got something," Voss whispered. They were in a hide position, buried under a camouflage net on the roof of the command building. North Ridge, grid 732418, single military-age male, moving slow. He's carrying something long. Reed swung his rifle to the coordinates. He found the figure in his scope, a man in traditional Afghan dress, moving carefully along the ridgeline. He was carrying a rifle, a long rifle. "Is that our guy?" Voss asked. Reed watched the man move, studied his gait, his posture, the way he held the rifle. "Maybe," Reed said, "but I'm not taking a shot until I'm sure." "He's in the open," Voss pressed. "We might not get another chance." Reed felt his pulse, 72 beats per minute. Too high. He was anxious, excited. The desire to take the shot was overwhelming. This could be the Taliban sniper. This could be the kill that saved lives. But Sarah's voice echoed in his head. "Don't pull the trigger. Let the rifle decide when it's ready." "Not yet," Reed said. They watched the man for 20 minutes. He moved to a small cluster of rocks and sat down. He was scanning the valley with his rifle scope, searching for targets. "That's him," Voss said. "That's got to be him." Reed's finger rested on the trigger. 900 meters. Wind was calm. Temperature was dropping as the sun set. He had the shot. He could make it. But something felt wrong. The man moved like a fighter, yes, but he didn't move like a sniper. He was too visible, too exposed. A real sniper would never sit in a position like that, silhouetted against the sky, unless he wanted to be seen. Reed's pulse spiked, 80 beats per minute. "It's a decoy," Reed said suddenly. "What?" "It's a decoy. The real sniper is somewhere else. This guy is bait." Voss looked at him like he was crazy. "You're saying we should let him go?" "I'm saying if we shoot him, the real sniper will see our muzzle flash, and he'll put a round through our position before we can move." Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So what do we do?" Reed thought about the stalk exercise at the Georgia range, the way Sarah had moved, the way she'd waited, the patience. "We wait," Reed said. "We watch. We let him think we don't see him." They waited. The sun set. The valley turned purple, then black. The decoy sniper stayed in position for another hour, then finally stood up and walked away. Reed and Voss stayed in their hide, and 15 minutes after the decoy left, Reed saw it. A muzzle flash. Not from the ridge where the decoy had been, from a completely different position. 200 meters west. Lower elevation. A perfect hide that overlooked the entire FOB. The Taliban sniper had been there the whole time, watching them, waiting to see if they'd take the bait. "Holy shit," Voss whispered. "You were right." Reed didn't feel triumphant. He felt scared. That could have been him. That could have been his muzzle flash. And he would have died never knowing what hit him. "We need to relocate," Reed said. "Now." They broke down their position and moved to a different building. They didn't sleep that night. They just watched the valley and waited for morning. The next day, Reed reported what he'd seen to Sergeant Kowalski. "The Taliban sniper is smarter than we thought," Reed said. "He's using decoys. He's patient. He's studying us the same way we're studying him." Kowalski nodded slowly. "So how do we beat him?" Reed thought about it. "We out-patience him. We don't take shots we're not sure about. We move slow. We think like him." "You think you can do that?" Reed remembered Sarah's words. "A sniper is a ghost that the environment forgot to erase." "Yes, Sergeant," Reed said. "I can do that." For the next 3 weeks, Reed hunted the Taliban sniper. It became personal, not in a vengeful way, but in the way that a chess match becomes personal. Two minds trying to outthink each other. Two predators circling. Reed changed his patterns constantly, never used the same hide twice, never moved at predictable times. He studied the way the Taliban sniper worked, the way he used decoys, the way he chose his positions. And slowly, Reed started to see the pattern. The Taliban sniper always shot from low ground, never from the high ridges where everyone expected him to be. He used the terrain to hide his muzzle flash, and he always shot at dawn or dusk, when the light was tricky and visibility was poor. Reed started building a profile, a map of probable positions, places where the angles were right, where the sight lines converged. And then, on a cold November morning, Reed found him. It was just before dawn. The sky was that deep blue color that comes right before the sun breaks the horizon. Reed and Voss were in a new hide position, buried in a pile of rubble on the edge of the FOB. Reed was scanning the valley with his rifle scope when he saw it. A slight distortion in the terrain, a place where the shadows didn't quite look right. He focused on the spot, waited, breathed, and then he saw the shape, a human form, partially concealed behind a low wall of stones. 870 meters away. The range was almost perfect. The Taliban sniper was getting into position. Reed felt his pulse. 68 beats per minute, still too high. He closed his eyes, thought about the Blue Ridge Mountains, about Sarah's father, about the empty space between heartbeats. He opened his eyes, checked his pulse again. 56 beats per minute. Better. "I have eyes on," Reed whispered to Voss. "Confirmed?" Voss asked. "Not yet. Stand by." Reed watched the figure through his scope. The man was setting up a rifle, moving slowly, deliberately. He was scanning the FOB with his optic, looking for targets. The place where there was nothing but him and the target in the cold mathematics of distance and wind. The Taliban sniper raised his rifle. He was aiming at something in the FOB, maybe a soldier on patrol, maybe a guard on a tower. Reed's crosshairs settled on the man's chest, right where the heart would be. He felt his pulse. Thump, thump, thump. He waited for the space between, and then he squeezed. The rifle barked. The recoil pushed back into his shoulder. He stayed on the scope, watching. 870 meters away, the Taliban sniper collapsed. He didn't scream, didn't move. He just fell, like a puppet with its strings cut. Reed cycled the bolt, caught the spent brass. He stayed on the glass for another 30 seconds, watching for movement. There was none. "Target down," Voss said quietly. Reed didn't say anything. He just kept watching, making sure. 2 soldiers were dispatched to recover the body and the weapon. They came back an hour later with a Russian-made Dragunov sniper rifle and a bag of personal effects. The Taliban sniper was dead. The threat was over. Sergeant Kowalski came to Reed's position that afternoon. He didn't say much, just handed Reed a cup of coffee and sat down beside him. "Hell of a shot," Kowalski said. Reed nodded. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel anything really, just tired. "You saved lives today," Kowalski continued. "That sniper would have kept killing if you hadn't stopped him." "I know, Sergeant." They sat in silence for a while. Then Kowalski said, "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Reed thought about the rain-soaked range in Georgia, about the woman in the faded Carhartt jacket, about the way she'd moved, the way she'd breathed, the way she'd made the impossible look easy. "I had a good teacher," Reed said. That night, Reed sat in his bunk with a piece of cardboard from an MRE box and a stubby pencil. The FOB didn't have much in the way of writing supplies, but he needed to say something, to tell someone who would understand. He wrote slowly, carefully, "Staff Sergeant Kinsley, I finally found the empty space. Thank you for teaching me how to be silent. The boys came home because you taught me to listen. Corporal Jax Reed." He folded the cardboard and put it in his pocket. He'd mail it when they got back to the main base. He didn't know if she'd ever read it, didn't know if she'd even remember him, but he needed to send it anyway. 6 months later, back in the United States, Reed's letter found its way to a small house in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a modest place with a wide porch and a view of the valley below. Sarah Kinsley sat in a rocking chair, the letter in her hands. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in a wooden box on the mantel. The box held other things, medals she'd never worn, commendations she'd never framed, a photograph of her father, taken the year before he died, and now a letter from a boy who'd learned to breathe. She didn't smile, but her eyes were soft. She stood up and walked to the window. The mountains stretched out before her, endless and ancient. The same mountains where her father had taught her to shoot. The same mountains where she'd learned that quiet didn't mean weak. Somewhere out there, in another range, another generation was learning. And some of them, maybe, were learning from the boys she'd taught. The knowledge spreading like ripples in water. That was enough. Meanwhile, back in Georgia, the advanced sniper course continued. New candidates arrived. Young, loud, convinced they were the sharpest shooters in the country. They went through the same tests, the cold bore, the stalk, the impossible shots in the wind. And in the observation tower, there was a new addition, a glass display case mounted on the wall. Inside the case was an M24 sniper rifle, scarred and worn. The stock was beaten up, the finish rubbed off in places, but it was clean, maintained, treated with reverence. Below the rifle was a brass plaque. It read, M24 Sniper Weapon System, Staff Sergeant Sarah Kinsley, Shadow of Shock Valley, first female sniper, 1,000 meters plus confirmed kill. Afghanistan, 2015. True power doesn't bark to be felt. The new candidates would walk past the case and barely glance at it. To them, it was just another piece of history, just another relic from a war they were too young to remember. But the instructors knew. Master Sergeant Thorne knew. Command Sergeant Major Vance knew. And sometimes, late at night, when the range was empty and the only sound was the wind in the pines, Thorne would stand in front of that case and remember. He'd remember the rain, the impossible shot, the way Sarah had moved, the way she'd taught without ego, the way she disappeared like smoke. He'd remember that some warriors don't need to shout to be heard. The months turned into years. Reed finished his deployment and came home. He stayed in the Army, made sergeant, then staff sergeant. He became an instructor himself, teaching the next generation of snipers. And every time he taught, he heard Sarah's voice. Don't fight the rifle. Become part of it. Find the empty space. Let the world disappear. He never told his students about her directly. He didn't need to. The lessons spoke for themselves. Some of his students went on to become legends in their own right. They made impossible shots in impossible conditions. They saved lives. They came home, and they taught others. The knowledge spread. The quiet discipline, the respect for the wind, the understanding that competence doesn't announce itself. Sarah never knew the full extent of her legacy, never knew how many lives were saved because she'd spent one rainy day on a Georgia range teaching 12 arrogant boys how to breathe. She didn't need to know. She lived in her small house in the mountains. She took care of her father's old hunting land. She walked the same trails she'd walked as a child. And sometimes, on clear mornings, she'd take the old bolt-action rifle out to the ridge and shoot at distant targets. Not to prove anything, not to maintain a skill, just because the stillness felt like coming home. One spring morning, 5 years after that day on the range, Sarah received a package in the mail. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper. No return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed a group of soldiers standing in front of a mud brick building somewhere in Afghanistan. They were dirty, exhausted, but smiling. In the center of the group was Corporal Jax Reed, now Sergeant Reed, holding a rifle. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Because you taught us to be quiet, because you taught us to listen, we all came home. Thank you." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Sarah looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she placed it in the wooden box on the mantel, next to the letter and the medals and the picture of her father. She walked to the window and looked out at the mountains. The sun was breaking through the morning clouds, casting long shadows across the valley. She thought about her father, about the lessons he'd taught her, about the rifle that had felt like a cannon in her small hands, about the empty space between heartbeats. And she thought about the boys on the range, the ones who'd mocked her, the ones who'd learned, the ones who'd carried her lessons into the dark places and come back alive. She didn't need a parade, didn't need recognition or awards or her name in the history books. She just needed to know that somewhere out there, a young soldier was checking his pulse, finding the empty space, waiting for the rifle to decide. That was enough. That was everything. Because true power doesn't bark to be felt. It doesn't announce itself with medals or monuments. It moves quietly through the world, changing things, one breath at a time. Sometimes history wears a uniform and stands on a stage. And sometimes history wears a faded Carhartt jacket and sits on a splintered bench in the rain, waiting patiently for the world to stop underestimating the quiet ones. Sometimes history is a woman who proved that competence doesn't need to shout. Sometimes history is a single shot, perfectly timed, that changes everything. Sometimes history never misses. The wind moved through the Georgia pines, carrying with it the echo of 1,000 lessons. The range was empty now. The candidates had all gone home. The target stood silent in the distance, but the shadow remained. The shadow of Shock Valley. The woman who taught a generation of warriors that the most dangerous people in the world aren't the ones who make the most noise. They're the ones who know how to be silent. And in that silence, in that empty space between heartbeats, that's where legends are born. That's where lives are saved. That's where the quiet ones become immortal. Sarah Kinsley stood at her window, watching the mountains she'd always known. The same mountains her father had known. The same mountains that had taught her everything that mattered. She checked her pulse one last time. 52 beats per minute. Still steady, still strong, still in the basement where fear couldn't reach. She smiled. A small, private smile that no one would ever see. And then she turned away from the window and walked back into her quiet life, leaving behind nothing but the coolness of her shadow. Because that's what ghosts do. They pass through. They change things, and then they disappear. But the world they leave behind is never quite the same.